Good afternoon, everyone. It's another Sabbath, another Saturday, and we have been doing this for the last 6 weeks. Technically, this is number 7. So those of you who have been faithfully following this live broadcast on Facebook for the last few weeks, I'm sure that it may have helped you some in dealing with the situations you are confronted with. This afternoon, I'd like to tackle a little different subject than we are normally accustomed to doing, and that is an occasion such as a lockdown, a crisis that forces us to withdraw from the regular situation, also perhaps provides opportunity to move forward to a little different setting in terms of life, relationships, and so on. But let me backtrack to some words that will conjure up some very negative images in your mind. Words like triad, mafia, yakuza, outlaw, highwaymen, and so on. These are terms that we usually associate with the really bad people of life, people who live by a code of violence and crime. At least that's the way most of us would think about them. And when you look down through Bible history, you find that there were people in biblical times who also lived by similar codes. The surprising part of the stories, though, is that sometimes God picks up such individuals in order to lead his people. Now, would God pick up a leader of a triad or a yakuza or a mafia to lead a church today? I think we would all be extremely perturbed or even disturbed, or maybe even into a state of protest if such a thing were to happen. But you see, in crisis times, you never know where leadership is going to come from. You never know what God is actually going to do. There is a story in the book of Judges that sort of brings all of these things together: crisis, outlaw, darkness, difficulties, relationship, rejection, desperation, and everything else. Now, we need to first understand the period of the Judges. That period lasted approximately 300 years. And many biblical scholars consider it to be the Dark Ages, equivalent of the Dark Ages for Israel's history. This was the time when Israel could never stay on track in its relationship with God. Things would start out well, and then when things got better, they would forget God, turn to some other gods to worship, and then God would allow some foreign nation to come and subjugate them and oppress them, and in desperation they would cry for help. Then God would send a warrior to deliver them, and peace would be made with God, and then the cycle would start all over again. Some 15 times this cycle was repeated in those 300 years. Now, the surprising part of the whole history is that every time they turn away from God, but then call on him for help, God always sends somebody to deliver them. Now, in the book, these deliverers are simply known as judges. The Hebrew word is judge, but they're not judges in the modern sense of the word. They're not sitting on some benches and handing out executive decisions. No, these were really warriors. Every single one of them. The only exception would be the lone woman judge by the name of Deborah. Now, these judges would come out, they would lead Israel or portions of Israel or certain tribes or sometimes just one city against their enemies, defeat them, bring a period of peace for a while, and then the cycle would start all over again. Now, in the middle of this period, somewhere in the middle of this period, we read the story of one of the most colorful and less understood judges of that history. Now, we are told that his name is Jephthah. He's called a Gileadite. He comes from a town known as Gilead, and his father was named Gilead. Now, as family history would go, Gilead did not have an auspicious birth. You see, his mother was a prostitute. The father was a married man, but he had a relationship with this prostitute, and the son was born. Now, as he grew up, the brothers, the half brothers who were from the legal wife, they did not like the fact that they had an illegitimate brother. They didn't want him to be part of the family, and the possibility of him inheriting anything that may have belonged to the father. And so it would seem that when the father died, the boy lost whatever protection he had, and his brothers drove him away from home. Being relatively young, without an education, with no career, nothing, Jephthah got together with a group of young men, and they turned to crime. They became outlaws. And when you read the story carefully, it sounds a little bit like the Robin Hood legends of England. Somebody who came from a fairly good estate and then was driven out, lost his position, his power, became an outlaw leader of a bunch of people who raided the rich and gave to the poor. So there was some heart in this young man. He didn't really become an outlaw just to fend for himself, but also to protect maybe people like himself who could not protect themselves. Now, we do not know what happened in the years that he was an outlaw. How did he grow in his relationship with God, or did he even have a relationship with God? Was he one of those men who looked at his position in life, at all the things that he had suffered, and blamed God for it? After all, he was an Israelite. And surely his misfortune must be partly put at the hands of God or at the feet of God. Surely if God was really God, he could protect him. But remember, this was the period of the judges, and so it's hard to evaluate the individual relationships any of these judges had with God. For what we can see in each and every one of their stories, these were not strong characters, none of them. They may have had super strength, they may have had super speed, they may have been great warriors, but they were highly flawed. In the words of a book, they were men with feet of clay. And they were the ones that were chosen. Now war came to the region from which Jephthah came. And one particular town, his hometown Gilead, found itself facing a big enemy. They were known as the Ammonites. Now these were sister nations, but constantly at war with each other. And when the people of Gilead, the Gileadites, saw that they were going to be overrun by the Ammonites, they may have sought for help from the other tribes. But the story kind of glosses over that point. What it does bring to attention is the fact that they had no help. And it seemed that the town of Gilead was not a town of warriors. Maybe some outlaws, but not a town of warriors. And so the elders of the city decided on a very radical course of action. Now, we don't have an army, we cannot get help from the other tribes. How are we to defend ourselves against the Ammonites? Somebody at some point said, well, why don't we call upon Jephthah? Now, if you have some holy imagination, you can probably just sit there and see the responses that would have gone around the council. What? Jephthah? Don't you know who he is? He's an illegitimate son. He is an outlaw. He's not a good guy. This guy has been robbing the rich from the town. How can we call in his help? But I'm sure, like in every debate of this nature, there were the other group that said, hey, wait a minute. As an outlaw, he knows how to fight. He knows about weapons. He's got a gang behind him. One of my nicknames at the present school where I'm teaching, particularly with the batch of grade 12 right now, is gangster. Something happened last year in class and they ended up coining this nickname for me, the gangster. So on our last online session last week, I reminded them that if they keep calling me the gangster, then that would make them my gang. You see, Jephthah had a gang. We do not know the size of his followers, but what we could probably surmise is that all of them were violent. They were outlaws, they were criminals, they did bad things. Surely, surely, these are not the kinds of people that God would pick. Or are they? Now, in desperation, people will often do the unexpected. And so the elders of Gilead, they found a way to communicate with Jephthah, called together for a meeting and says, we need help. Would you be willing to come and help us out against the Ammonites? Now, Jephthah is not some paragon of virtue. He sees this as an opportunity to maybe strengthen his position. And so he starts to bargain with them. If you want me to help you against the Ammonites, what are you prepared to give? Well, I think anybody would do that. When somebody, especially somebody who lives outside the law like Jephthah, I'm not going to do something for you unless you do something for me. Now, the people of Gilead were clearly very desperate, because what they said is, if you will lead us, then we will make you our leader. Now, the word that they use there is not the word for king, but it comes pretty close to that concept. Basically, they offered him the throne of Gilead, if they had one. We will make you the king, we will make you the governor, we will make you the prime minister, whatever you want. Think about getting a blank check like that. But just please come and help us fight against the Ammonites and drive them away. Now, here is where we begin to see that Jephthah may have been an outlaw, partly not his own choice, partly by force of circumstance, but that he had some inkling, some understanding, or some kind of a relationship at some level with God. Because his response to them in Judges chapter 11 is rather interesting. At first he told them, didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Aren't you the very people who turned me into an outlaw to begin with? Now you're coming to my help. And the elders of the town said, yeah, we know what we did to you, but please, we will make you this leader if you will come. And then Jephthah said this, since that's true, if you are bringing me back to fight the Ammonites, and if the Lord gives them to me, then I will be your leader. That is verse 9. Pause for a second to consider what he said. Okay, you're asking for my help. I may be ready to do that, but I also need to be sure that God will help me. He said, if those two things come together, then I will accept your offer of being king. Now, Jephthah did not just jump into this job. He weighed the options, the reward that would come of being the leader of Gilead, the desperation of the people. Some of them were his own family, and it's possible that maybe one of those brothers were in that council of elders, or at least an observer. And then there is God. He looked at the situation and he says, okay, I will help you, but I need God to help me. Now, Jephthah is not going to walk away from this without any reward, without any benefit. There is that reward sitting in front of him. He will now be the leader, a virtual king for Gilead and maybe even the surrounding territory. But he would not go into the battle without God. When you look at the judges, whether it is Gideon or Barak, Samson or Jephthah, they somehow, in their own limited ways and their own knowledge of God, or their very flawed relationship with God, they still understood that without God, they cannot accomplish anything. Now, in the case of Gideon and Samson, we have angel visitation to announce their birth, to provide a calling. In the case of Jephthah, we meet no angels. There is no superhuman appearance. There's no E.T. Example for him. God did not speak directly. It was just the people who were saying, we need your help. Yes, we rejected you, now we need you. Now, I'd like to ask you a question at this point. Maybe a question that you must personalize. How many of us here would be prepared to reach out to help the very people who had caused us harm? I don't think there's anybody who's listening to me right now who's been driven out of their homes, or maybe there is. Driven out of home simply because you do not truly belong. Maybe because you're not seen as part of the group. Maybe because you're different, racially, religiously, by creed, by economic status, or whatever. If you've had that experience, I guess you can relate to Jephthah. But many of us may have a different experience. How would we react to people who have driven us, given us a life of crime, and then come back for help? You know, crisis points, as I said earlier, makes people to do strange things. This was an opportunity for Jephthah to take revenge, to take it out on the town, to hold grudges. He could have very well said, you drove me away, now you go and solve your own problem. He could have said, I need some blood payment. After all, look what you guys cost me. He could have asked for a lot of money. Of course, they were offering him everything anyhow. But I have a feeling that many of us wouldn't have been as giving as Jephthah. We'd probably say, why should I help these people? Look at what they have done to me. After all they did, how dare they even come to me for help? I have a feeling that if this were to happen to me, I'd probably have those thoughts in my heart. I may not verbalize them, but I'm sure that they would arise somewhere deep here. Why should I even bother with them? And Jephthah had survived for many years with this gang of his. He did not need their help. It's another thing about crisis. Very often the people that we need help from may not need our help. And so they were prepared to kind of bow down to this man that they had kicked out. But somewhere in this very dark story, we learn that Jephthah had some faith in God. That idea that God must go with him, otherwise he will not take up the crown. He actually is guaranteeing them victory before becoming king. He could just as easily have said, okay, you crown me king first, then I will lead you to war. No, he says, okay, I will go to fight. My men will go with me. If we win, if God gives us victory, then I will come back and you crown me as king. There's something else that we see about Jephthah in this story. He has a daughter, and it seems she is his only child. And here we get a clue that his theology was not entirely complete, because he thought that he needed some kind of a bargaining chip with God. You see, after all, the people of Gilead had bargained with him, and he knew he needed God's help. Maybe he should bargain a little bit with God. So he makes a promise to God. He says, if you will give me victory, when I return from the battle, the very first person who comes out of my house, I will offer as a sacrifice to you. And we meet one of the great mysteries of the Bible and one of the great mysteries of the book of Judges about what really happened to the daughter. Now, some people reading just English translations are convinced that he sacrificed her. But don't forget, he's an Israelite. And the Hebrew is very nebulous at the end of the story. Did he really sacrifice her? Or did he find a redemptive option? We don't know what happened. What we do know was his commitment. When he came back from battle, he had made a promise to God. And even though he was an outlaw, he knew that you don't make a promise to God and then renege on that promise. But his heart must have totally broken when he comes towards his home and he sees his only daughter approaching, coming out, so happy to see her father. Now, Jephthah had to then break the bad news to his daughter. Remember another man in the Bible who had to break a really bad news to his child? God came to Abraham, you must go and sacrifice Isaac and Moriah. And Abraham takes time, 3 days before he dared or could reveal the truth to Isaac. And I think it was only when they reached the top of Mount Moriah and there were nothing else to do, no more place to go, that he had to tell him, God has asked me to sacrifice you. Now, in both of these stories, we see a child, Isaac in the case of Abraham, and the daughter of Jephthah, neither of them fought the father against the decision. As far as we can tell in Genesis, Isaac allowed himself to be bound by his dad, put on the altar, and ready for sacrifice. Jephthah's daughter simply requests her father to grant her a 30-day mourning period, kind of like mourning for the dead, because she is going to die. In both cases, Abraham and Jephthah, we see children who have somehow absorbed the faith of their father, and through their father had come to trust God and trust the father who trusted God. Here's an amazing story. An outlaw, an outcast, but a man who never lost sight of God and whose faith and relationship with God was just strong enough for the daughter to accept it as the will of God. Now, how many of you listening to me right now, if your father was to come to you and say, I made a promise to God, or God has made a command to me, and I have to sacrifice you, how many of you would just sit there quietly and say, okay, Dad, do it because God has asked, or because you have promised, I agree? I don't think I would. Would you? Seriously? Honestly? But in both of these stories, one who's called the father of faith, one who's called an outlaw, we find men who trusted God enough and lived their faith enough for their most immediate family to accept it as the will of God. To me, this says a lot about Jephthah, more than the fact that he was an illegitimate child, that he was outcast by his people, more than the fact that he was an outlaw and lived in crime. What is important with Jephthah is that somewhere during those years of crime, he had developed a relationship with God strong enough to be a model, a role model for his daughter. Now, we cannot solve the riddle of what really happened to his child. Was she really sacrificed? Or, as some scholars have suggested, some other possibility based on the ambiguity of the text. But that is not the point of what we are trying to say today. The important part of this story, the standout part of this story for me, is the fact that Jephthah did not even attempt to take revenge against the people of Gilead, not by word nor by act. At no point and in no way in this story do we find Jephthah wanting to get even. Instead, there seems to be a heart for his people that was much softer than his life of crime suggested. And that is the puzzle. That God could see that heart when the rest of society could not. God could read into the mind and the heart of Jephthah and realize that he was the man for this crisis moment, when his own people, all they could see was an illegitimate child that did not belong. And yet this child had grown up into a man who not only loved God to some degree, but also held no real hard feelings against his people. How many of us can say that we could do what Jephthah did? That those who have treated us really badly, if they come to us for help, even if it's a real crisis moment like what we have these days, that we would still find the heart to sort of not only forgive them, but to not even try to get even with them, with all the opportunities handed to him on a plate. The human heart can be very dark. And I'm sure that many of us, if we had such a clear-cut opportunity like Jephthah to get even with our persecutors, we would probably try to do something. But not Jephthah. And I think that the back of Jephthah's mind must have been the realization that whatever action he took that day, that God would be watching. God would be a factor. And so his words to them, to me, really stand out. Okay, I will go and fight the Ammonites with you. And if the Lord gives me victory, then I will accept your leadership. He was basically proposing to the people that I cannot take any reward from you unless I can see the hand of God. So Jephthah did not go into this battle because of that promise of reward. Jephthah did not go into this battle because he could get a big loot. He probably did. Jephthah did not go into this battle because he had no crime in his life and he was a good guy. No, he went into this battle because he knew that at a moment of crisis, it would have been wrong for him, with all the justified reasons he had, to reject their plea for help. Because throughout the book, God never rejects Israel's plea for help. No matter how many times they turned their backs on him, God would always answer, always send a judge, always send a deliverer. And I think somewhere along the line, this strange outlaw, this Robin Hood of the Bible, he learned that about God. I suspect that Jephthah never had a chance to go to any religious school, any religious training. He probably wasn't allowed close to the tabernacle at any point. He probably didn't have regular Shabbat worship like the rest of Israel may have done. And it's most likely he never offered sacrifices in his life, except maybe the one that he came close to in the life of his own daughter. And yet, this was the man that God chose. Now, the text doesn't say that God chose him. The text says that he committed himself to the cause, believing it to be the call of God. You see, Gideon was called by an angel. Samson's birth was announced by an angel. But Jephthah is more like us. How many of us have heard the voice of the angel, have heard a calling from God directly? No, most of us are like Jephthah. We are going about our lives, our business, when there is that conviction, that impression that God wants us. And whenever there is a crisis for his people, God always finds a warrior, a deliverer, even if he happens to be an outlaw. And so it says that the elders of Gilead, they said to Jephthah, "The Lord is our witness if we do not keep our part to the bargain." Now, what really happened in that story is virtually what we call a covenant. They basically made a covenant. He made a covenant with them, they made a covenant with him, and they all made a covenant with God. And you know that in biblical terms, a covenant had to be kept. A covenant could not be broken. And all of these people were basically, through their words, signing and committing themselves to this one cause, the deliverance of Gilead from the Ammonites. Jephthah doing it without extracting any revenge, the people of Gilead accepting his help despite the rejection of earlier times, and all of them recognizing, God, we need your deliverance. And I think Jephthah taught them a spiritual lesson that day. It's not me that you really need help from. It is God you really need help from. But I am the sword of God. Think of Jephthah as an outlaw turned warrior. You know, to use Japanese analogy, a yakuza who became a samurai. But doing that because he believed that he was fighting for God. And Gilead, despite their early rejection of him as a person, they were still God's people. Therefore, they were still his people. We will be tested, not just in times of crisis like this, but maybe in other situations of life, when we will find people who will do really bad things to us. And then at some point, those same people may actually need our help and come in desperation begging for our help. The big question for us at that time, would we have the heart of Jephthah? Not only to come to their aid, but to do so without any revenge, and to take no reward until he is sure that God was with him. Can we learn that lesson? Can we apply that lesson? Now, if you live long enough, and I think I've lived pretty long, there will be people in life who will treat you like Gilead did Jephthah. But there will also be moments in life when some of those very same people are going to need your heart of God. Remember what God told Samuel at the choice of David? Samuel looked at the firstborn of Jesse, a very impressive soldier in the army of Saul, and Samuel was smitten. Surely this would be a great king. And God says, no, not him, because you can only see what's outside. I can see what's inside. And so God made an announcement that day that the people he calls to serve him will always be people whose heart beat to the same rhythm as his own. So he describes David as a man after my own heart, We don't have that description in Judges, but it would seem to me that Jephthah was a man after God's heart in his very own way. And so God made him a judge. Now, most of us, when we read the book of Judges, we are really captivated by the famous victory of Gideon, by the super strength of Samson. But surprisingly, Jephthah's story occupies one of the longer narratives. These three judges, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, occupy the longest narratives among all the judges in the book. So clearly, he was an important part of that period. Now, Jephthah realized that if he did not come to the aid of Gilead, then perhaps he could never claim the aid of God for himself. Or at least I think that's what he believed. And maybe we ought to learn that lesson as well. If we are not willing to go to the aid of our enemy, maybe God cannot come to our aid either. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus was explaining his concept of love, he made those incredible statements. If you love only those who love you, there is no reward from God for that. That is such a natural thing that God doesn't need to reward you for it at all. However, if you love your enemies, if you pray for those who would persecute you, and bless those who would use you or abuse you, then you are truly children of your Father in heaven. And therefore be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect in love. If we want God to be always on our side, we need to have his heart to always be on the side of others, even our enemies, even those who reject us, who turn against us, who say bad things about us. Rather than get all upset and worked up and say, why are these people against me? I haven't done anything wrong. After all, it was not Jephthah's fault that his father had this relationship with that prostitute. It wasn't his fault that he was born into such a terrible situation. It wasn't entirely his fault that he became an outlaw. It was his only survival, perhaps. He kept none of that in his heart. What he kept in his heart is, you need my help, I need God's help. Let's put them together and we can solve the problem. Sooner or later, we will come out of this crisis. And maybe we will meet somebody out there who hadn't been really good to us before we went into this crisis mode. How would we respond at that time? And maybe that person has suffered a great deal because of the crisis more than ourselves. How are we going to respond to that person? Would we put our noses up at the person and say, serves you right, because you did like that to me, God is judging you? Or would we be Jephthah and say, fine, God has helped me, now I will help you? Loving our enemies is not about how we feel towards them, but rather how we act towards them. It is not about saying, oh, I love you, the way we would say to a significant other or children or parents. No, it's about saying, you have harmed me, but I will return only good towards you. Imagine learning such a lesson from an outlaw. And none of us here today is an outlaw. If Jephthah could learn that lesson, you and I can learn that lesson too. And maybe all of this lockdown situation has given us an opportunity to reflect on those people who have done terrible things to us, who have said bad things about us, and figure out how we would respond towards them. If you can do that, if I can do that, then maybe the lockdown has been a beneficial thing. I am glad this afternoon we don't have sound effects of lightning and thunder like last week. But I'm also glad that another week is over and maybe we're coming closer to the peak and the freedom that we all long to have. When that happens, when we go back to our lives, I hope that we will carry the heart of Jephthah. God, I need you. These people who hated me once, they need me now. And so God, I'm asking you to help me to help them. If we can do that, then I would say that we have learned a great lesson during our isolation time. And if we can walk away from all of this with that lesson in our hearts, in our minds, then we can all make a far, far better world than the one we started with when we entered this crisis. I wish you all a very good week ahead, and I hope you enjoy the remaining hours of the Sabbath. I'd like to pray for you before we end the session. Father God, we have learned from a very unusual man in Scripture, an outlaw who became a deliverer, an unwanted man who became a wanted leader. We have seen his heart and his faith and his willingness to trust in you and know that a relationship with you requires a better relationship with other people, including those who do not want us or like us. And so I pray for everyone who has been listening this afternoon and who will keep listening to this session, that we can all learn the lesson of Jephthah, that we can all figure out how to love you and how to love others because we love you, that it is your love in our hearts that enables us to be good to those who aren't to us. And so we thank you for that lesson. May it stay very close to us, not just for today, but for the remaining years of our lives as well. For we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Shalom, everyone.